The paint tasted sweet. That was the detail none of the women forgot. After the toothaches, after the jaws that crumbled into gray fragments, after the spines that fractured under the weight of standing up, they remembered the sweetness. A trace of gum arabic or sugar added to the glowing compound, intended to keep the paint from drying too quickly on the brush. It made the act of pointing a camel hair brush between their lips feel pleasant, almost satisfying. A small pleasure in a long shift. They were painting watch dials with radium, and the radium, once inside their bones, would not leave for 1,600 years. This is the deep archive. We leave the surface now. The hatch seals. The pressure builds. Below the noise of daily life, below the headlines and the tidy summaries, there are rooms that have not been opened in decades. In one of them, a chemist's invoice billed to a dead woman's estate for testing the bones the company poisoned. In another, an electroscope in a basement morgue at 2 a.m., gold leaves falling beside a fragment of rib. In a cemetery in New Jersey, a Geiger counter still clicks. We are going down. The evidence is sealed, but it is not lost. Open the first file. The spinthariscope is a small brass cylinder, no larger than a pocket watch, with a single eyepiece at one end. You hold it to your eye, and in the darkness of the viewing chamber, you see something that should not exist. Tiny pinpricks of light, green-white, random, endless, flaring, and dying against a black field. Each flash is an atom of radium decaying, hurling an alpha particle into a screen of zinc sulfide, the impact converted into a photon, a silent firework, a private, invisible apocalypse happening inside your hand. In 1917, the year the United States Radium Corporation opened its factory in Orange, New Jersey, these flashes were described by one observer as fairy dust. The word radioactive did not yet carry its weight of warning. It carried wonder. The story of what came after does not begin in Orange. It begins in a shed outside Paris in 1898, where Marie Curie and her husband Pierre processed tons of pitch-blende ore, the black, tarry residue of uranium mining, to isolate something that the periodic table did not yet have room for. The ore was more radioactive than its uranium content could explain. Something else was hiding inside it, something that gave off energy without combustion, without heat, without visible change to itself. It was a violation of thermodynamics as understood at the time. Energy from nowhere. Or, not nowhere, but from somewhere deeper than chemistry had ever looked. After months of crystallization and fractional separation, they produced a white powder that glowed faintly in the dark. It was 1 million times more radioactive than uranium. Marie named it radium from the Latin radius for ray. She was 31 years old. She carried a sample in her pocket, enjoying the faint warmth it produced. Her notebooks from that period, now stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, remain too radioactive to handle without protective clothing. They will remain so for another 15 centuries. The margin of one notebook page reads, in her handwriting, a simple observation: the radium phenomenon appears to be a property of the atom itself. She did not know that the property was death. Or rather, she did not know that death could be so slow, so specific, and so polite in its manners. By 1904, radium had become a commercial sensation. Mixed with zinc sulfide, a phosphor that converts radiation into visible light, it produced a paint that required no battery, No sunlight, no flame. It glowed perpetually, a captive star in a ceramic pot. The formula was patented by a New Jersey company as Undark, a name that carried no irony at the time. The paint was marketed not merely for watch dials, but for instrument panels, exit signs, and the luminous hands of military compasses. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers relied on radium-lit gauges to navigate the dark. The poison was not hidden. It was strapped to their wrists. But the more astonishing development was not industrial. It was nutritional. Entrepreneurs, with the full endorsement of a scientific establishment that had not yet learned to be afraid, added radium to toothpaste, to face cream, to chocolate bars, to suppositories. In Germany, a company sold radium water crocks, clay vessels lined with a radioactive glaze, into which you poured tap water and allowed it to steep overnight, infusing your morning glass with what was called perpetual sunshine. The water tasted faintly metallic, but that was the price of vitality. Doctors prescribed radium injections for arthritis, for high blood pressure, for the depression that followed influenza. A man named Eben Byers, a wealthy American golfer and industrialist, drank several bottles of radium water per day for 3 years. His jaw later fell off. That is not hyperbole. His jaw fell off. The medical examiner who opened his body reported that his bones crumbled like ash beneath the scalpel. The strange part was not that radium killed. The strange part was that nobody saw it killing until it was far too late to look away. Marie Curie died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, a condition in which the bone marrow, the body's blood factory, simply stops producing new red cells. Her blood was starved of oxygen. Her tissues failed. She was 66 years old. For decades, she had carried radium in her pocket, handled samples without gloves, breathed the dust of decaying ore in her unventilated shed. In her final years, she was blind and feverish, her retinas scarred by radiation cataracts, her fingers burned by the same element she had pulled from the earth with her own hands. She did not know, or perhaps she knew, but she did not stop. The archive does not say. The spinthariscope, that small brass tube of fairy dust, was invented in 1903 by William Crookes, a chemist who also discovered thallium, invented the radiometer, and spent the last decades of his life convinced that telepathy was the next frontier of physics. He called his device a spinthariscope, from the Greek spintharis, meaning a spark or scintillation. He gave one to Marie Curie. She held it to her eye and watched her own discovery disintegrate, flash by flash, one atom at a time. She is said to have smiled. The paradox of radium is that it was never hidden. It was celebrated. It was marketed, advertised, prescribed, and swallowed. It was a miracle wearing the coat of a suspect, but nobody asked to check the lining. The element that danced in the dark was not a secret poison slipped into an unsuspecting public. It was a gift, freely given, wrapped in the authority of science and the enthusiasm of commerce. The women who would later point their brushes with their lips in Orange, New Jersey, were not victims of a conspiracy. Not at first. They were victims of a consensus. And a consensus, when it is wrong, is harder to fight than a lie. Because a lie has a single author, a consensus has none. The spinthariscope still works, if you can find one. The radium inside it decays by about half every 1,600 years. The flashes you see are slower now than they were in 1903, but only slightly. Each one is a signature of an atom that has decided, for no reason and with no warning, to become something else. Radium decays into radon gas, which decays into polonium, which decays into lead. The road from miracle to ash is a straight line. It just takes time. In Paris, Marie Curie's notebooks sit behind lead glass. The librarians do not open them. To turn a page, one signs a radiation waiver and wears a dosimeter. The ink has faded, but the paper still emits a low, steady, patient count of disintegrations per minute. The same count, in different units, that Dr. Harrison Martland would later measure in the bones of dead women in a New Jersey morgue. The same count that still rises, faintly, from the cemetery in Orange, where the ground remembers what the plaques do not say. The element that danced in the dark did not intend to kill. Intent is not a property of atoms, but the archive does not ask about intent. The archive asks only about consequence. And the consequence began, as so many archival consequences do, not with a crime, but with a discovery. A shed in Paris. A white powder that glowed. A hand reaching into a pocket, closing around a warm glass tube and thinking, what else can this do? The answer was everything, and the answer was nothing good. The factory on Alden Street in Orange, New Jersey did not look like a place where bones went to die. It looked like a place where young women laughed in the dark. The United States Radium Corporation opened its doors in 1917, the same year American troops crossed the Atlantic. The war had created a new appetite for luminous instruments, watch dials that a pilot could read in a moonless cockpit, compass faces that glowed through the smoke of artillery. The company's signature product was a paint called Undark, a mixture of radium chloride and zinc sulfide. It required no flame, no electricity, no sun. It simply glowed perpetually in a soft green that seemed to come from nowhere. The girls who painted it called the color the ghost light. They were young. Most were between 15 and 21. Some had left school after the 8th grade. Others were immigrants from Poland or Slovakia, their English still uncertain, their families grateful for any work that paid. The company preferred women for a reason that sounded almost delicate. Small fingers were better at painting the tiny numerals and hash marks on a watch dial. A man's hand, they said, was too clumsy for the job. The work was piecework, 1.5 cents per dial. A skilled painter could finish 250 dials in a 10-hour shift, sometimes 300. The math worked out to about $3 or $4 a day, respectable money for a teenage girl in 1917, more than she could earn in a textile mill or a laundry. The factory was clean, well-lit, and warm in winter. The supervisors were polite. The company took photographs of the women in their work aprons, their faces lit by the soft green glow of the paint on their brushes, and published them in trade magazines as proof of American industrial ingenuity. The strange part was that the women themselves glowed. The radium dust settled into their hair, their clothing, the creases of their knuckles. After a shift, they would stand in the coat room and watch their own hands emit light, a faint, cold phosphorescence that faded over an hour or two. They thought it was beautiful. They thought it was harmless. One woman later recalled holding her palm up to a boyfriend in a darkened movie theater and watching him smile at the green constellation of her fingers. Another remembered walking home through the unlit streets of Orange, her dress glowing at the hem, her apron still shimmering from the day's work. She said she felt like a firefly. The company encouraged this. On Friday nights, supervisors would turn off the factory lights and let the women dance in the dark, their luminous aprons swirling, their teeth faintly aglow from the residue they had swallowed. The dancing was good for morale. The photographs show young women laughing, their mouths open, their teeth catching the ghost light like a row of tiny lamps. Nobody told them that the ghost light was a contract signed in the bone. The lip-pointing technique was not invented by the United States Radium Corporation. It was standard practice in fine painting, watchmaking, manuscript illumination, the delicate art of applying enamel to miniature surfaces. You dipped your camel hair brush into the paint, applied the stroke, then rinsed the brush in a small dish of water. To maintain a perfect point, you twirled the damp bristles between your lips. It was quick, it was efficient, and every girl learned it within her first week. The paint tasted sweet. Radium chloride has no sweetness, neither does zinc sulfide. The sweetness came from a trace additive, perhaps gum arabic, perhaps a sugar-based binder, intended to keep the paint from drying too quickly on the brush. But the sweetness did something else. It made the act of pointing the brush feel pleasant, almost satisfying. Some women recalled touching their brushes to their tongues deliberately, out of habit, out of the small pleasure of a sweet taste in a long shift. Others said they swallowed the paint without thinking, the way a seamstress might wet a thread. Each swallow contained micrograms of radium. A microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. It is an amount so small it cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be weighed on any scale available in 1917. But radium does not need to be large to be dangerous. It needs only to be inside you. Once ingested, radium behaves like calcium. The body cannot distinguish between the two elements. It sends radium directly to the bones, where it incorporates itself into the crystalline structure of hydroxyapatite, the mineral matrix that gives your skeleton its strength. And there, locked inside the bone, the radium begins its slow work. It decays. It emits alpha particles. It irradiates the marrow from within. The way a small fire in the basement of a wooden house does not need to be large to bring down everything above it. The supervisors knew none of this, or they knew some of it and chose not to share it. The line between ignorance and concealment is thin in the archive, and the archive does not offer clean verdicts. What the supervisors told the women was this: the paint was harmless. It contained no radium. That was a lie, and a clumsy one, because the paint glowed only because of radium. They also said that radium was a health tonic, that small amounts strengthened the blood and brightened the complexion. Some women were given small vials of radium water as a bonus. The company doctor, when asked, said that lip pointing was perfectly safe, as long as workers practiced reasonable cleanliness. Reasonable cleanliness meant washing your hands before leaving the factory. It did not mean avoiding the ingestion of a radioactive isotope that would settle into your jaw and your spine and your sternum, where it would remain for the rest of your life, which would turn out to be much shorter than anyone expected. The women did not know. They could not have known. The word radiation was not yet a household term. Marie Curie was still alive, still revered, still carrying radium in her pocket. The New York Times had run advertisements for radium face cream and radium suppositories. The medical establishment had not yet raised a unified voice against the element. The danger was not hidden. It was simply not yet visible. And so, the ghost girls of Essex County went to work each morning, tied on their aprons, dipped their brushes into the glowing paint, and pointed the bristles with their lips. They gossiped about boys. They planned their paychecks. They danced in the dark on Friday nights. They walked home through the unlit streets of Orange, luminous smudges against the brick and asphalt, and they did not know that they were already dead, not breathing, not yet. But the contract had been signed. The body keeps its own accounts, and it does not accept returns. One of them, a girl named Grace Fryer, would later describe the taste of the paint as not unpleasant. Another, Catherine Schaub, said she remembered the way the brushes tickled her lower lip. Neither of them would have guessed that the sweet taste was a down payment on a jaw that would crumble, a spine that would fracture under the weight of walking, a heart that would stop at 32 while her bones still glowed faintly in the dark. The factory on Alden Street is gone now. The site has been redeveloped. No plaque marks the location, but the ground remembers, not in the way memory is stored in words, but in the way radium remembers, atom by atom, decay by decay, a half-life of 1,600 years. The women who danced in the dark did not know they were carrying the future inside their teeth. And the future, when it arrived, did not come as an explosion. It came as a toothache, then another toothache, then a jaw that would not heal. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable, and the story was already written in the only ink that never fades: calcium, phosphate, and a trace of an element that should have stayed in the earth. The toothache started like any other. Molly Maggia was 24 years old in 1922. She had stopped working at the United States Radium Corporation 2 years earlier, after her sister Amelia became ill. The factory had been a good job, better than most. She had painted watch dials with her friends, laughed under the black lights, walked home through the dark streets of Orange with her dress glowing at the hem. She had pointed her brush with her lips, tasted the sweet paint, swallowed what she swallowed, like everyone else. Then came the tooth. The dentist extracted it without complication. The socket should have closed in a week. Instead, it stayed open, a small wet crater in her lower jaw that would not seal. Then the bone around it began to change, not break, not ache, something stranger. The jawbone started to crumble from the inside, as if something were eating the calcium and leaving only a gray, granular dust. The dentists tried again. They removed more teeth. They scraped the socket. They prescribed mouthwashes and poultices. Nothing worked. The necrosis spread. By 1923, Molly's lower jaw was a catastrophe. The bone had disintegrated to the point where surgeons had no choice. They removed the entire mandible, the curved bone that holds the lower teeth, shapes the chin, anchors the tongue. What remained of her face collapsed inward. She could not eat solid food. She could not close her mouth. She spoke when she could speak, in a wet, halting whisper. The surgeons attempted reconstruction, harvesting bone grafts from her hip and shaping them into a new jaw. Within weeks, the grafts necrotized too, the same gray rot, the same failure to heal. Her body was rejecting itself, or rather, something inside her body was making sure that no new bone could live. She died in September 1923. The cause of death was listed as sepsis and hemorrhage. No one connected her to the factory, not yet. But she was not alone. Over the next 18 months, 5 more young women from the same plant presented with identical symptoms: toothache, extraction, non-healing socket, progressive mandibular necrosis. One after another, their jaws unraveled. The doctors of Essex County had never seen anything like it. Phossy jaw. The bone rot that afflicted match factory workers who inhaled white phosphorus presented similarly, but these women had never worked with phosphorus. Syphilis could cause bone lesions, but the tests came back negative. Cancer? In 5 young women from the same workplace, all with the same pattern of destruction? The coincidence was too precise to be coincidence. Enter Dr. Harrison Martland. He was the chief medical examiner of Essex County, a man in his late 40s with the face of a tired bulldog and the patience of a laboratory balance. He had no industrial toxicology training. He had no Geiger counter. The instrument would not be invented for another 4 years. What he had was a stubborn curiosity and access to the dead. In 1924, Martland performed autopsies on several of the deceased dial painters. He removed sections of their ribs, their vertebrae, the remaining jaw fragments. He asked a physicist friend to borrow an electroscope, a simple device consisting of 2 gold leaves in a sealed glass jar. When ionizing radiation passes through air, it strips electrons from molecules, making the air conductive. The gold leaves, charged with static electricity, will fall as the charge leaks away. The faster they fall, the higher the radiation. Martland placed a gram of bone ash from a dial painter's skeleton near the electroscope. The gold leaves fell. They fell fast. He compared the rate to the fall caused by a known quantity of pure radium. The calculation was crude by modern standards, but the result was unmistakable. The bone ash was emitting as much radiation as several micrograms of radium per gram. The women's skeletons had become radioactive sources. They were, quite literally, hot. He coined a term for what he was seeing: radium necrosis. But the word was just a label. The mechanism remained obscure. How could a substance ingested years earlier still be active inside the body? Why did it attack the jaw first? Why did it refuse to heal? The answers lay in bone biology. Radium, chemically identical to calcium, is absorbed into the hydroxyapatite crystals of the skeleton. Once incorporated, it does not leave. The body has no mechanism to remove a mineral from the lattice once it is laid down, and radium does not decay quickly. Its half-life is 1,600 years. So the women who swallowed a few micrograms of radium in 1917, a few invisible specks of glowing dust, carried those same atoms in their jaws and spines for the rest of their lives, which turned out to be short. And as each radium atom decayed, it emitted an alpha particle, a helium nucleus traveling at 5% of the speed of light, carrying enough energy to shatter DNA strands, kill osteocytes, and slowly, silently, convert living bone into dead matrix. The jaw dies first because the jaw remodels faster than any other bone in the human body. Every time you chew, every time you speak, every time you swallow, the mandible undergoes microscopic cycles of resorption and rebuilding. The cells that perform this remodeling, osteoclasts and osteoblasts, are particularly vulnerable to radiation. They die. The bone becomes a cemetery of its own cells. The blood supply fails. The tissue turns gray, then black. Fragments work their way through the gums like splinters through skin. And because the radium is still there, still decaying, still irradiating, no surgical removal can ever be complete. You cannot cut out your own skeleton. Martland did not know all of this in 1924, but he knew enough to be certain. He published his findings in a medical journal, naming radium as the cause of the jaw necrosis and linking it directly to the lip-pointing technique. He was careful, clinical. restrained. He did not name the company. He did not need to. The facts spoke for themselves. The operating room where surgeons attempted to reconstruct Molly Maggia's mandible is now just a room in a hospital that has been renovated twice. The bone grafts taken from her own hip, carved into the approximate shape of a jaw, were buried with her. They would still be radioactive today, if anyone cared to dig them up. No one has. A photograph exists of Molly before the surgeries. She is young. She is smiling. She is unremarkable. A round-faced woman in a high-collared blouse, her hair pinned up, her eyes looking slightly to the left of the camera. She looks like someone you might have passed on the street in 1920 and forgotten by the next corner. No photograph exists of what came after. The family did not permit it. The medical records describe the outcome in flat, professional prose: complete mandibulectomy, recurrent necrosis of graft, patient expired. That is all. But the archive does not need photographs. The evidence was never in the images. It was in the bones, and the bones, unlike the company's denials, could not be deposed. They could only be measured. The gold leaves fell. The truth fell with them. And somewhere in the basement morgue of Essex County, at 2 a.m, a tired medical examiner wrote in his notebook, 3 years dead, still hot. The jaw that unraveled was not a mystery. It was a receipt, and the bill had not yet been presented to the company that wrote it. The company responded to the dying women the way companies often respond to bad news that arrives in installments. It hired a better doctor. Not a better physician, a better witness. Dr. Frederick Flynn was young, well-dressed, and willing. He held a medical degree from Columbia and a consulting contract with United States Radium Corporation. In 1924, as Molly Maggia's jaw was being carved out in fragments and 5 other women from the orange factory were losing their teeth and their ability to swallow, Flynn stood before the press and declared that radium paint posed no ill effects whatsoever. He had evidence, he said. He had fed radium to rats. The rats had not died, not quickly at least. The rats lived for 2 years, a full rat lifespan, and showed no obvious tumors, no jaw necrosis, no spontaneous fractures. Flynn presented this as definitive proof. He did not mention that 2 years is not long enough for radium skeletal damage to manifest. He did not mention that rats, unlike humans, do not live long enough to develop the bone sarcomas that take 5 to 15 years to appear. He did not mention that the rats had been fed radium in single large doses, not the daily micro-ingestion of a worker pointing her brush 200 times per shift. The rats, in other words, were the wrong animal, the wrong dose, the wrong duration, and the wrong question. But they were the answer the company needed. Flynn also addressed the lip-pointing technique directly. He called it safe, provided workers used reasonable cleanliness. He did not define reasonable cleanliness. He did not explain how any amount of hand washing could remove radium from the digestive tract once swallowed. He simply asserted, with the flat authority of a paid consultant, that the women had nothing to fear. Some of them were already dead when he said it. Dr. Harrison Martland read Flynn's statements in the medical journals. He had been watching the dial painters die in his own morgue. He had measured their bone ash. He had seen the gold leaves of his electroscope fall like a stopped watch. He knew the rats were a distraction, but he was also the chief medical examiner of Essex County, a public official who depended on the goodwill of local industry. The United States Radium Corporation was a major employer. Its lawyers had long memories, and Martland had a career to protect. So he softened his conclusions. In early 1924, he published a paper that mentioned radium as a possible factor in the jaw necrosis, but stopped short of a definitive link. He used careful language. He allowed for alternative explanations. He did not name the company. He did not say that lip pointing was the delivery mechanism. He did not say that the women had been poisoned. He said, in the passive voice of professional caution, that further investigation is warranted. The company was satisfied. The families were not. And the dead, who cannot be deposed and cannot be intimidated, continued to speak from the ground. Amelia Maggia had died in 1922, the year before her sister Molly. The cause on her death certificate was anemia, a vague catch-all term for blood failure. She had worked at the radium factory for 2 years. She had pointed her brush with her lips. She had swallowed the sweet paint. And then she had died at 24, her body so worn down that her doctors assumed she had simply run out of blood. Martland obtained permission to exhume her in late 1924. He worked at night, in secret, not because he was doing anything illegal, but because he did not want the company's lawyers to learn what he was doing until he had the answer. The grave was in a small cemetery outside Orange. The ground was cold. The coffin, when they opened it, contained a skeleton that had been underground for nearly 3 years. He brought bone fragments back to the morgue. He placed them near his electroscope. The gold leaves fell, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the speed of a guillotine. The bone was still radiating. 4 years after ingestion, 2 years after death, the radium inside Amelia Maggia's skeleton was still decaying, still emitting alpha particles, still ionizing the air in a sealed glass jar in a basement morgue at 2 in the morning. He wrote in his notebook, 3 years dead, still hot. The phrase was not a scientific notation, it was a verdict, and it changed everything. Martland could no longer soften his conclusions. The evidence was not in a medical journal or a laboratory report. It was in his hand, a fragment of a dead woman's rib that glowed on no visible spectrum but registered its presence with the indifferent precision of a falling gold leaf. The company could deny. The company could hire better doctors. The company could publish rat studies and call lip pointing safe. But the dead do not lie, and they do not settle. In 1925, Martland published his full findings. He named radium as the cause. He identified the lip-pointing technique as the root of ingestion. He described the mechanism, radium, chemically identical to calcium, incorporated into bone, where it decayed for years, irradiating marrow and killing osteocytes, leading to necrosis, fracture, and death. He coined the term radium necrosis, not as a label, but as a tombstone. He also did something that cost him more than any scientific conclusion. He named the factory. He named the paint. And in doing so, he turned a medical mystery into a public record. The basement morgue where Martland worked is long gone. The electroscope, a brass cylinder with a glass window, 2 gold leaves thinner than a breath, has been replaced by scintillation counters and germanium detectors that can measure radium in parts per trillion. But the scene remains in the archive. A single man in a white coat, alone, at an hour when even the janitors have gone home, holding a piece of bone up to a flickering light and watching a gold leaf fall. He had no reason to be there except curiosity. He had no reason to exhume Amelia Maggia except the suspicion that the dead knew something the living refused to say. He was right, and the dead, in their wordless testimony, did what no lawyer could do and no corporate denial could undo. They turned a county medical examiner into the archive's most reluctant witness. The paradox of Dr. Harrison Martland is that he never wanted to be a hero. He was not a crusader. He did not march on the factory with a megaphone. He was a civil servant who did his job, who looked at the evidence in front of him, and who, when pressured to look away, looked closer. The company's denial did not make him angry. The rats did not make him indignant. The bones made him certain. And certainty, once it settles into a man's notebook, is very hard to dislodge. By the time Flynn published his third defense of radium paint, still citing the rats, still calling lip-pointing safe, still insisting that reasonable cleanliness was all that stood between a young woman and the grave, Martland had already submitted his final report to the state of New Jersey. The report did not use the language of accusation. It used the language of autopsy, organ weights, bone densities, radiation counts. But the conclusion was unmistakable. The company's doctor had said the paint was harmless. The county's doctor said the paint was death. And the only way to know which doctor was telling the truth was to ask the women who had already died. They did not answer. They did not need to. Their bones answered for them. Grace Fryer was 29 years old in 1927, but she looked 50. Her spine had fractured from the inside, not from a fall, not from an accident, but from the slow dissolution of bone that radium had been conducting for a decade. She walked with 2 canes when she could walk at all. On bad days, she used a wheelchair. Her jaw ached constantly. Her teeth were loosening. She knew, because the doctors had finally told her, that her skeleton was becoming a source of radiation. She was still alive, but her body had already begun the work of dying. She was not alone. 4 other women from the same factory, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice, shared her symptoms. Spontaneous fractures, bone pain that morphine could only soften, not silence. In some cases, the same jaw necrosis that had killed Molly Maggia. They had all worked at the United States Radium Corporation between 1917 and 1922. They had all pointed their brushes with their lips. They had all swallowed the sweet paint. And now, 5 to 10 years later, the bill had arrived. They decided to sue. The decision was not simple. None of them had money. None of them had legal training. Most of them were bedridden for days at a time. But they had something that the company had tried very hard to bury: the truth, written in their own collapsing bones. And they had Grace Fryer, who had worked as a bookkeeper after leaving the factory and knew how to keep records, how to write letters, how to persist. She began visiting lawyers in the spring of 1927. She traveled by train from her home in New Jersey to Newark, to Jersey City, to New York. She sat in waiting rooms, her cane leaning against the chair, and explained that she and 4 other women had been poisoned by their employer. The lawyers listened. The lawyers asked questions. The lawyers said no. Not because they doubted her, because they were afraid. The United States Radium Corporation was a powerful company. It had wealthy backers. It had hired one of the most respected physicians in the state to defend its practices. It had already fought off workers' compensation claims from the families of dead dial painters. A lawsuit from 5 dying women would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially career-ending for any attorney who took it on. The legal system, in its practical operation, protects the powerful, not through conspiracy, but through inertia. A poor plaintiff with a strong case is still a poor plaintiff, and poor plaintiffs lose. Grace Fryer visited more than a dozen lawyers. Each one turned her down. The 14th was Raymond Berry. He was not a typical corporate attorney. He had built his career on representing workers, immigrants, the kinds of clients who could not afford to pay up front. He took cases on contingency, meaning he would receive a percentage of any settlement or verdict. But if the case failed, he received nothing. He had a reputation for stubbornness and a dislike for powerful corporations that bordered on the personal. When he heard Grace Fryer's story, he did not say no. He asked to see her medical records. The records were damning. X-rays showed holes in her bones, areas where the mineral matrix had simply dissolved, replaced by nothing. A biopsy confirmed the presence of radium. Berry also obtained testimony from a physicist who had measured the gamma radiation coming from the women's bodies. They were, in the most literal sense, radioactive. He took the case. The depositions that followed revealed a corporate indifference so thorough it bordered on the surreal. The company had been conducting its own studies as early as 1923, measuring radium in the breath and urine of current workers, documenting the same isotope that Martland had found in the bones of the dead. But they had shared none of this information with the women or their doctors. When a former worker named Irene Rudolph died in 1925, the company hired a chemist to analyze her bones. The chemist confirmed the presence of radium. The company then billed Irene Rudolph's estate for the testing. Let that fact sit for a moment. A young woman died. Her employer had reason to believe that her death was caused by their product. They tested her remains, confirmed the cause, and sent an invoice to her family. The invoice was paid. By the time the case reached court in June 1928, the 5 plaintiffs were in terrible condition. Grace Fryer's spine had fractured so severely that she could not turn her head. She sat in a wheelchair in the Newark courtroom, her body twisted, her hands trembling. Catherine Schaub had lost most of her teeth. Edna Hussman walked with crutches. Albina Larice, the youngest of the 5, had a jaw so fragile that she could only eat liquids. Quinta McDonald had a tumor growing in her leg, a bone sarcoma, the same cancer that radium causes when it sits inside the skeleton for long enough. The defense attorney, a man named John W. Davis, who had run for president 4 years earlier, did not deny that the women were sick. He could not. Their bodies were the evidence. Instead, he argued that the statute of limitations had expired, that too many years had passed between their employment and their lawsuit. He also argued that the women could not prove that their illnesses came from radium because radium was everywhere. It was in the soil. It was in the water. It was a natural part of the environment. The jury listened. They looked at Grace Fryer in her wheelchair. They looked at the 4 other women, their canes, their crutches, their faces showing pain that no amount of courtroom composure could hide. Then the defense attorney asked Grace Fryer to demonstrate the lip-pointing technique. She had not worked at the factory for 6 years. She had not touched a radium brush since 1922. But she raised her hand to her lips, her fingers trembling, and held it there. She did not speak. She did not need to. She held the pose for 10 seconds. The jury watched in silence. The case never reached a verdict. In late 1928, before the jury could deliberate, the United States Radium Corporation offered a settlement, $10,000 per plaintiff, plus $600 per year for life, plus all medical expenses. It was not a large sum. $10,000 was worth perhaps $150,000 today, but it was not the millions that the women deserved. The company also inserted a condition rarely discussed in the press coverage. The women agreed never to speak publicly about their illness or the case again. They signed. They had no choice. They were dying, and they needed the money for their medical bills, and a trial could take years, and they did not have years. Of the 5 plaintiffs, only one lived beyond 1933. The others died of bone cancer, of aplastic anemia, of infections that their radium-weakened bodies could not fight. Grace Fryer, the woman who had visited 14 lawyers, the woman who had sat in the wheelchair and held her hand to her lips for 10 seconds, died in 1933 at the age of 34. Her spine was so brittle that the undertaker had to handle her body like glass. The courtroom in Newark is still there, though it has been renovated. The jury box where 12 citizens watched a dying woman raise her hand to her lips is now a different shade of wood. The legal system that forced Grace Fryer to prove her own poisoning, to demonstrate the gesture that had killed her, has been modified, slowly, unevenly. But the paradox remains. The same machinery that protects corporations from liability also provides the only avenue for the injured to seek redress. It is not a fair system. It was never designed to be fair. It was designed to be slow, expensive, and exhausting. And it is all of those things. But every so often, a case comes along that the system cannot ignore. Not because the law is just, but because the evidence is too bright to look away from. 5 women with canes and crutches and wheelchairs. A handful of bone fragments that still glowed. A jury that watched a young woman's hand rise to her lips and stay there, frozen in a gesture that was not a performance but a memory. The memory of a brush, a paint pot, a sweet taste, and a promise that had been broken before it was ever spoken. The case did not save them. Nothing could save them. But it created a record. And a record, once filed, does not disappear. It waits. It accumulates. It becomes the foundation for the next case, and the case after that, until finally, the architecture of workplace safety is built, brick by brick, from the ashes of women who glowed in the dark. The company's invoice to Irene Rudolph's estate, the bill for testing the bones of a woman they had poisoned, still exists somewhere, in a file box, in an archive, in a storage facility in New Jersey. No one has thrown it away. It is evidence. And evidence, unlike a corpse, has no statute of limitations. The cemetery in Orange, New Jersey, is not marked on any tourist map. There is no sign, no plaque, no manicured path leading to a designated memorial. It is a small plot of grass, slightly overgrown in places, surrounded by a low iron fence that has lost several of its teeth to rust. If you did not know what lay beneath, you would walk past it without a second look. In the 1970s, a researcher came here with a Geiger counter. He had been studying the long-term effects of radium ingestion, and he knew that some of the dial painters had been buried in this unassuming ground. The grass was wet. The morning was cold. He walked slowly from one grave to the next, holding the instrument close to the soil. The counter clicked. It clicked faster over certain plots. The readings were well above background, not dangerously high, not enough to harm a living person standing on the surface, but unmistakably present. The bones beneath his feet were still emitting. After more than 50 years in the ground, after rain and frost and the slow turning of seasons, the radium inside those skeletons was still decaying. 1,600 years is a half-life. 50 years is a heartbeat. He left a small stone on each grave. No name, no explanation, just a stone, the kind you might pick up from a driveway and carry without thinking. Then he packed his Geiger counter and drove away. The stones are still there, or they were the last time anyone looked. The grass has grown over some of them. Others have been kicked aside by children playing in the field. The graves themselves have no markers. The women were buried under plain headstones, if they had headstones at all, and time has worn the inscriptions smooth. One of them says Friar, another says Magia. The rest are illegible or missing. This is where the story ends, not with a verdict or a regulation, but with a quiet field and a Geiger counter that refuses to stay silent. The settlement in late 1928 had given the 5 plaintiffs $10,000 each, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, might buy a modest car today, plus $600 per year for life, plus medical expenses. The women signed. They also signed a clause that the company insisted upon. They would never speak publicly about their illness or the case again. Their testimony, their depositions, their demonstration of the lip-pointing technique, all of it would be sealed, buried, erased from the public record. The company did not want other dial painters getting ideas. It did not want its liability to spread. Of the 5 women, only one lived beyond 1933. The others died of bone cancer, aplastic anemia, or infections that their radium-weakened bodies could not fight. Grace Fryer, the woman who had visited 14 lawyers and held her hand to her lips in a Newark courtroom, died in 1933 at the age of 34. She had spent her last years in and out of hospitals, her spine so fragile that a sneeze could fracture a vertebra. She never spoke about the case again. The settlement required that, and she kept her word. The radium dial industry did not disappear. It continued in the United States into the 1960s, using safer paints, less radium, better ventilation, no lip pointing. Workers wore gloves. Supervisors warned them not to eat or drink at their stations. The glowing watches still sold, though the market had shifted from military instruments to civilian wristwatches with luminous numerals that faded after a few hours. The new generation of dial painters did not know the names of the women who had died for the right to work in safety. Or if they knew, they did not say. The term radium girls was coined decades later, long after the last of the original dial painters had died. It appeared in a magazine article, then a book, then a documentary. The phrase has a strange quality, almost affectionate, almost nostalgic, as if the women were characters in a Gothic fairy tale rather than workers who had been poisoned by their employer. But the archive does not care about names. The archive cares about the paper trail, and the paper trail leads from the factory in Orange to the courthouse in Newark to the cemetery where a Geiger counter still clicks. The legal legacy of the Radium Girls is larger than any settlement. Their case established the principle that workers could sue employers for occupational diseases caused by toxic exposures, not just for injuries from accidents, but for illnesses that took years to manifest. Before the Radium Girls, the statute of limitations often began running on the day of exposure, not the day of diagnosis. After the Radium Girls, courts began to recognize that some poisons work slowly, that a disease may not appear until a decade after the first swallow of sweet paint, that justice cannot be measured by a calendar. In 1970, more than 40 years after Grace Fryer sat in a wheelchair in a Newark courtroom, the United States Congress created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA did not mention the Radium Girls in its founding documents, but the agency's mandate to ensure safe working conditions for every American worker was written in the only ink that matters: the blood and bone of those who had gone before. Every time an OSHA inspector walks through a factory floor, every time a worker reports a hazardous condition without fear of retaliation, every time an employer is required to disclose the chemicals in a workplace, the ghost of the dial painters is present, not as a haunting, as a foundation. Marie Curie's papers are still stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. To consult them, a researcher must sign a radiation waiver. The notebooks are beautiful, filled with meticulous calculations, elegant handwriting, small observations about the behavior of an element that no one had ever seen before. Marie did not know that her beloved radium was killing her. Or perhaps she knew, in the way that scientists often know but choose not to look too closely. She died of aplastic anemia in 1934, the same year that Grace Fryer was buried in an unmarked grave in New Jersey. The two women never met. One discovered the element that would become a poison. The other was poisoned by it. Neither lived to see the other's name in print. The cemetery in Orange still exists. You can find it if you look. The addresses have changed, the streets have been repaved. The factory on Alden Street is long gone, replaced by a strip mall and a parking lot. But the ground remembers. Not in the way memory is stored in words or photographs, but in the way radium remembers, atom by atom, decay by decay, a half-life of 1,600 years. The researcher who came with his Geiger counter in the 1970s is probably dead now. His instrument is in a museum or a landfill. But the stones he left on the graves are still there, or they were the last time anyone looked, and the bones beneath them are still glowing, not with light, with the slow, patient, irreversible process of becoming something else. Radium decays into radon. Radon decays into polonium. Polonium decays into lead. The road from miracle to ash is a straight line, and the women who walked it first did not know they were walking at all. They thought they were dancing. They thought they were glowing. They thought the sweet taste was harmless, that the green light on their aprons was a kind of magic, that the future would be kind to them because the present had been so bright. The future was not kind, but the future was informed, and that, perhaps, is the only mercy the archive can offer, not a happy ending, but an ending that teaches. The girls who glowed in the dark did not save themselves. They saved the ones who came after. Their bones are still in the ground, still radiating, still testifying, and if you stand very still in that cemetery in Orange, on a cold morning with a Geiger counter in your hand, you can hear them, not in words, in clicks, each one a small, quiet reminder that the bill was paid. Not by the company, not by the doctors, by the women who pointed their brushes with their lips and tasted something sweet. The stones are still there. The grass grows over them. The ground remembers. And the archive, which never forgets and never forgives, closes its cover on this chapter, not because the story is finished, but because the story has been told. The rest is silence, and the occasional click of a Geiger counter somewhere in New Jersey where the dead are still warm. The descent showed us that the dead do not lie. Their bones became the only honest witnesses. A falling gold leaf in a basement morgue at 2 a.m. A sweet taste remembered by women whose jaws were already crumbling. Grace Fryer's trembling hand held to her lips in a Newark courtroom. Stones left on unmarked graves where a Geiger counter still clicks. The evidence was never in the company's rat studies or its paid physicians' assurances. It was in the skeletons that kept radiating 50 years after burial. The paradox of radium is that it was never a secret poison. It was a miracle, freely given, wrapped in the authority of science and the enthusiasm of commerce. The girls who danced in the dark did not know they were drinking a contract signed in calcium and alpha particles. And the institutions that should have protected them, the factory, the doctors, the legal system, failed not because they were evil, but because they were slow, and because the most dangerous assumption is that someone else has already checked. The pressure on the hull begins to ease. The darkness above us thins to gray, then to a widening circle of light. The hatch opens, and for the first time in an hour, cold sea air fills the lungs. The file on the Radium Girls closes, but the evidence does not stay below. It rises with us, the half-life of 1,600 years, the invoice billed to a dead woman's estate, the silent testimony of bones that refuse to stop talking. If this kind of quiet descent into history and evidence is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The stones are still in the grass. The ground remembers. We surface, but we do not forget.